Good morning and welcome to First Congregational Church in Guilford, Connecticut, where we say no matter who you are and where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. We are excited that you are joining us this Indigenous Peoples Weekend, wherever you may be, at home, on vacation, on the road. We are grateful that you are taking some time out to worship with us this morning. So wherever you are, I invite you to gather yourself together into one spot for this time together that we have set aside to be in community with God and with one another and with ourselves. And so try not to think too far ahead into next week or think too far back into the week that we just finished. But be here, be present. Don't multitask, just be here and invested in this time of worship. Let us begin our worship this morning with a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. This is one of the parables that Jesus tells as he is preparing for his arrest and soon crucifixion. Listen to what Jesus says. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to collect the produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned yet another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them the same way. Then he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us seize him and get his inheritance." Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyards to other tenants who will give him the produce at harvest time." May we be granted wisdom and understanding to this text. Have you spent any time with a toddler recently? I remember when my brother's kids were that age, in the 2 to 3 years old, there was a lot of mine, and I need this, and I do it. And it's cute, this sort of low stakes experimentation with independence and interaction with the world. It's a prime age to introduce sharing and how to ask for help and how to be a member of the household. Toddlers are delightful, says the person who does not live with a toddler. In reading the parable of the wicked tenants this morning, it struck me that these tenants are acting an awful lot like, well, violent toddlers. The business agreement between the landowner and the tenants is common in the biblical age. The landowner prepared the vineyard, the tenants would live there and work the land, and when harvest time came, the produce would be shared. Not a 50-50 split, but a good enough deal as to become a tenant. Sometimes parables in the Bible are tricky. We have to really excavate them to find the meaning for the modern reader. But in this parable, the allegory is right there. It's a little too on the nose even. God, the landowner, has prepared this world for us, and we are to produce a harvest for God. And the harvest that we produce is not grapes, but rather fruits of the Spirit, signs that we are people of God. The Apostle Paul categorizes these fruits of the Spirit in the book of Galatians. He says they are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and self-control. We, as stewards of the world, have not had a robust harvest of those fruits of the Spirit. And when we have had any harvest, we tend to squander those things for ourselves or for those who look like us and sound like us. God, the landowner, has sent envoys to us to invite us to fulfill our end of the bargain, to share the harvest. And these envoys have been prophets and activists and disruptors and change makers, those who have told the truth about the state of the world, the treatment of the marginalized, and the course of destruction that our overconsumption has sent us on. And yet, like the tenants of the parable, we have not welcomed these messengers from God. We have not listened or changed our behavior. We have been hostile. We have dug in to protect our comfort, our privilege, and our possessions. Like the tenants of the parable, we have confused stewardship with ownership. This confusion is a genetic trait handed down by our ancestors. As the world was being colonized by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Catholics, they took on the persona of aforementioned violent toddlers. They just showed up in this new world and saw no evidence of European settlements, and so they called it terra nullis, or empty land, and followed that up with mine and I need this. Those who were bankrolling these conquesting toddlers encouraged them to subdue the land and capture the people in the name of Christ and crown, forcing conversion of these natives, even conversion after their murder. But no actual crimes against humanity were committed because the early settlers to this country were protected by a set of papal decrees taken together and are called the Doctrine of Discovery. These documents come from the 5th century. So according to a bunch of wealthy, high-ranking white men in the church and state, any land and peoples of what we now know as the Americas and Africa could be lawfully taken into possession to expand the reign of Christianity throughout the world. Religion was used as a thin veil over the real motivations of royal rivalries, greed, and acquisition. God sent native peoples to these toddlers to invite them into co-stewardship of the land, into sharing the fruit, both literal and metaphorical. But they confused stewardship with ownership. And just like in the parable, these servants of God, those who were the natives of those lands, were beaten, killed, and stoned. It's a painful history. It's hard to look back at our ancestors and admit how intricately the roots of the American Christianity and American racism are intertwined. Many of us progressive Christians would like to think that the root is all that remains, and we've successfully cut down any outgrowth of racism, and we've been able to preserve the faith and have forced the ugly bits to die from neglect. Those roots of racism in American Christianity are deep, and they are established, and they are tenacious. As early as 2005, the Doctrine of Discovery was cited as precedent in the court case, the City of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Tribe of New York. The case is about property taxes, and if land bought back by the Indian nation of Oneida was then sovereign land held by the tribe and not subject to property tax. But since sovereignty was relinquished during the Doctrine of Discovery age in the first settlements, buying back the land from the proceeds of casino money does not then return the land under native sovereignty. It's still under the rule of property tax. The roots of racism, colonialism, and patriarchy are still producing the fruit of injustice. But what would the world look like if we understood the difference between stewardship and ownership right from the beginning? It is truly difficult to imagine. There would be no such thing as manifest destiny. There would have been no trail of tears, no American-Mexican War, no native boarding schools. If our ancestors had arrived on this land and had been ready and willing and open to learn from its native inhabitants on how to co-steward the earth, would we be facing a global meltdown right now? If we had learned to and taken influence from the earth-centric faith traditions about how the earth is mother, is source, is belonging, and not some wild to be tamed and conquered, would we even have endangered species right now? It's a dizzying thought experiment. How radically different could the world be? At the end of the parable, Jesus gathers the crowd and says, what should happen to these wicked tenants? And the obvious answer is that when the landlord returns, he will drive out those tenants, he will punish them for their wrongdoing, and the vineyard will be handed over to better stewards. Each generation has been given an opportunity to choose a different story than the generation before them. We have the chance to relinquish our pursuits of ownership and start behaving as stewards. Owners are interested in maximizing profits. Stewards are interested in best practices that benefit everyone. Owners want instant gratification. Stewards want to set up those who come after them for success. Owners make decisions based on their own ambitions. Stewards base decisions on long-range community visioning. Owners want to possess. Stewards want to maintain. Owners are individuals. Stewards are communal. Everything that we have, even our very breath, belongs to God. God has planted vines of grace in us that once tended will produce fruits of the Spirit. God has set a fence around us in our identity as Christians. God has put a watchtower among us in our accountability to one another. God has dug out a winepress that our fruit may be transformed into service. The choice is ours on what sort of tenants we will be. Will we take the vineyard that we've been given and see our labor as justification to possess it? Will we follow the voices of those who grumble against the owner and be persuaded into rebellion? Will we too reject those sent by God to instruct us in the ways of stewardship? Will we refuse even the heir, Jesus Christ? He tells us that good tenants love God with all that they are and love their neighbor as their self. Will we decide that this love is too big of a sacrifice? Will we fight instead for our right to ownership of what God has given us freely and with grace? I don't have the answer to these questions. I believe the church, in both the universal sense and the local one, can be a vanguard of reconciliation. I believe it. We can lead the way in historical and cultural reckoning of the consequences of our colonialist roots. The paradigm shift from owner to steward is a painful process. It is not easy or uncomplicated. It is not quick or painless. We begin by telling the truth and amplifying the voices that have been silenced for generations. We begin in lament, strive for justice and mercy, and rejoice in all the incremental ways in which God's kingdom is coming on earth. Slowly, we pull up the flags of conquest and loose our fists of possession. Everything we have belongs to God anyway. We are merely trustees, stewards, tenants. As we mature in our faith, may our cries of mine become an understanding of what is ours to tend. May our declarations of I need this become an exclamation of our interdependence. In our most ancient psalm book, the Psalms, Psalm 24 begins, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the earth and all who live in it." May this be our song of stewardship. May this be our anthem, that nothing we have is our own, but what God has given us to watch over. Amen.
This piece is by Connor Chi, a Navajo pianist and composer. It is entitled Sand Painting for Piano Number 5, Turquoise.